Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, if only virtually. So today I'd like to tell you about how language might be represented in biological and artificial neural systems. So biological neural systems take signals in the environment and transform them to serve the goals of the organism and its behavior. And we can see this transformation as a form of computation. So in Randy Gallistel's seminal book, The Organization of Learning, he gives entertaining examples, like, for example, the dead reckoning of the honeybee's neural system that calculates how to get back to its origin position, even as, for example, the location of the sun changes in time. Now, this is interesting because transformations that neural systems perform can sometimes seem to be the very environment itself to us. So take, for example, the fact that we can describe the same image either as a set of pixels, objects, or for us as humans, we can perceive and represent relations between those objects. For example, aboveness or belowness, and that doesn't involve any other perceptual signal being present per se. Now, this seems to indicate that neural systems are capable of extracting information from the environment that's latent in the perceptual sense, or that is abstracted over or from the base sensory inputs. So in this case, pixels being perceived as forming objects, which in turn form relations. And relations then can be generalized from input to input so that anything can be above. In fact, something that was once below can later be above, etc. There's a rich and vast literature in cognitive science about this that I won't go into much here, but I will say it has influenced my thinking about language and language representation. In as much as that we probably need to have flexible and generalizable representations that are structured in order to be able to explain language behavior. So to foreshadow this ability to generate structured representations and then apply them to novel inputs or combine them in novel ways according to rules is demonstrated in its expressive power most evidently in human language. So somehow in language we transduce vibrations in the air, so variations in air pressure, into linguistic structure and meaning. I don't have to emphasize to this audience how marvelous that ability is, but still, how can we explain this ability? To make the problem more concrete, that is the problem that our perception action neural system faces, let's deconstruct the problem in the context of the phrase blue and white striped sweater. We can compare it to blue, white, and striped sweaters. Now, these utterances are highly similar. In fact, the sequence of words is nearly identical, but they mean very different things. And that's because of the hidden structures of language and the fact that language is compositional. It can be built up and broken down into parts. Now, structure and composition make such distinctions possible. Okay, now here's one way of representing structure, and this is an awful, patently false, wrong cartoon that I am likely offending many people with, but I made it to illustrate a minor point. And that is that in the first case, the adjectives blue, white, and striped have to be combined together to modify sweater. And the result of that is there is only one sweater, and that sweater has blue and white stripes. In the second case, each adjective has its own individual branch in the structure, however you choose to represent it, leading it to be combined individually with sweater, resulting in 3 sweaters, each with each individual adjective's property applied to it. Now, to perceive this difference, listeners have to exploit grammatical cues, likely in the rhythm and intonation in speech, to map incoming speech onto their knowledge of grammatical structure to compute the resulting structure and meaning. Presumably, we have to do this by combining our internal knowledge or our internal model of language with speech or sign as it comes in. But where are we actually starting from in the system? So essentially all we have is bursts of energy in speech that we perceive as a sequence of words in time, or a distributed physical signal in sign, or a sequence in text. And nonetheless, psychological models of language processing for all these contexts have always stressed the importance of timing and rhythm in each of these, and especially in speech, in retrieving structure and meaning. So crucially, timing and rhythm are necessary for understanding prosody. That's the stress patterns, pauses, and intonations in speech. And these in turn are thought to be critical for generating syntactic structures and meaning. So although these ideas are very classic in psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics, they're only recently being taken up into computational models and neurobiological theories. So here in my research group, we're really trying to exploit this idea that time and rhythm are crucial for computation and for language processing in order to understand how it is that structure is uncovered or generated by the brain. All right, so if I had to summarize the question really shortly, I would say, how do we go from a linear structure, whether it's from speech, text, or sign, a linear sequence, whether it's from speech, text, or sign, to a structure and a meaning? So we know a lot about the brain circuits involved in understanding language. We don't know as much about the computations and processes per se that lead to the generation of structure. But maybe this is because representing structure isn't exactly simple. And so as we all know from daily life, right, tools like autocorrect and Google Translate don't always get language right, although they do surprisingly well. They often miss out on core aspects. And this is likely because, I dare to say, a language is represented in these models as a sequence of associations, no matter how complex or high dimensional you make those associations. So sometimes you can have one word related to another, the probability of a word given another, or you can have more conditionalized probabilities, or you can use distributions from a large corpus, but crucially not as a structure or grammar. That's in practice just mostly what we do. But what this misses out on is what's actually miraculous about language, which is actually what I think we all want to explain. And that is how we can understand things that are not highly probable or predicted. And the fact that we can understand things even when we've never heard them before, or we don't predict that we're going to hear them. For example, if I say blue and white striped whale, I can't be sure. It's unlikely that you've heard blue and white striped whale before. Maybe some of you have. But I can be sure that it was an unpredictable utterance for you to hear. You weren't expecting me to say that. In fact, you'd recently heard blue and white striped sweater. And you may have even thought of that as I was saying blue and white striped. But still in the end, you heard blue and white striped whale. And the point is, models based on associations alone can't explain how we do this. And the dominant models in psychology and neuroscience and artificial intelligence are still fundamentally based on association and not on structure, although there are beginning to be exceptions to that. But in any case, I see this as a major problem. So my goal is to try to understand how we perceive the structure of language and determine what essential properties of our brains are being used to represent linguistic structure. So the guiding idea is that the structure is important, so how can we compute it? The first clue lies in the timing and rhythm of speech, and that they might be important for perceiving structure and meaning. The key idea is that we're linking words together in time, and this creates a structure and a rhythm that goes beyond just a sequence. So when words are recognized, our knowledge of their structure is also activated. And simply incorporating time and rhythm in a neural network model of language can help us mimic this process and represent one way that structure is built up as more information arrives. But as I said before, many of our computational models in cognition and language are based on associations. And that's an important part of our knowledge of language, and that should be captured. But what we're missing out on then is an account of structure. And if we only apply these associationist models to our neuroimaging data, I think we're missing out on some of the more core computations of language in the brain. So for example, systems like this will struggle to represent composed meaning. And part of you could say, well, that's maybe just because they weren't designed to do that. They need to be augmented and developed to do that. And that's also, I think that's completely legitimate. But there are also existing ways in cognitive science that structured representations have been cashed out. And I think we in language can learn a bit from examining those. So again, now I'm going to probably use some other representations that might be offensive to some. So there might be some semanticists out there that really don't like this choice of example, but I'm trying to just show the problem simply. So if we want to combine two things together, we need independent representations of a role and a filler to express a composed meaning in a system architecture that leads to flexibility and generalizability. So here we can reduce the problem of how we can compose the set of blue things with the set of things that are potatoes in order to get the meaning blue potatoes, right? But we still don't know whether that operation of combination in the mind and brain is more like a concatenation or a conjunction or an intersection. So if we don't even know exactly how to denote that process, either on many levels of analysis, from conceptual to formal, to computational, to neural, we don't know what that computation is on any of those levels of description. You can imagine how the problem that we're facing explodes when we try to consider something like a sentence or a proposition. So anyway, rather than to overwhelm us, right, what I want to illustrate here is that if you want to have a system that has the ability to combine information, even in the limit it can achieve compositionality, we need to have a notion of independent representation in the system. That means that we need to find a way to have simple and complex representations in a logical formalism that all depend on this notion of role and filler, right? There's a variable and it has a value. and those things can be put together and taken apart by some operator. Now that assertion requires independence between the variable and its value, right? Independence between a role and its filler. And this is something that most neural network models and most language models are not necessarily focused on achieving at this moment, and I think to their detriment. So now I'm going to talk about a body of work that I developed together with my friend and collaborator Alex Dumas at the University of Edinburgh. All right. So Alex and I want to posit that the requirements for any kind of system to be compositional. We can sort of harken back more to the notion of predicate logic here. We can say if you want to have something that's like a predicate, you want to have a system that can combine a role and a filler, you need to represent a predicate explicitly and independently of its arguments. So that means that, for example, if you want to encode something like bigger than, you want both Sally to be bigger than Bill, and you want Joe to be bigger than a ball, you want that notion of bigger than to point to the same representation in the system. So you don't want to have multiple representations that have the same meaning in a system. So that's one important aspect of the system. So the predicate has to be explicit, and they have to have an independence between the roles that are the fillers and the roles of that predicate. So that's to say the same representational stuff should represent bigger than, whether it's Sally that's being bigger than Bill or Joe is being bigger than a ball, right? Secondly, we want to have these roles and fillers be bound to each other for processing dynamically. And by this means there has to be some kind of mechanism or a tag that represents that binding information that a certain filler goes in this role that's independent of the particular things that are being bound, right? So binding has to be independent of what's bound, and it shouldn't change the representation of what is bound long-term in the system. Sure, you can learn about the things that go together, and you can learn information about a bound predicate, a role and filler bound together, and for example, where they occur, how frequent they occur, you can learn probabilities about them. But the point is that you don't change the long-term representation. And this, you'll see later why this is important. And this leads then to the fact that you can change the expressive power that a system has when you imbue it with these properties, right? And in the relational reasoning literature in cognitive science, right, that qualitatively changes the nature of inference problems that the system can solve, the way that the system can solve things and learn, which I'll talk about briefly later. But in language, I think this is just a core base property that we need. So a predicate representation allows the system to base inferences on a specific subset of properties of an object and not the holistic object itself, right? And those properties of the object specified by the predicate allow then the nature of inductive inference in the system to change. And you can see that in this example. So that means that if you have a system with this property, you can appreciate the similarity of f of x to f of y, regardless of the similarity of x and y. And this is going to be really important, actually core to human thought, and something that is just naturally expressed in human language as a system. So for example, we can say that a fuzzy cactus and a fuzzy penguin have something similar about each other. That is, they're both fuzzy, regardless of the fact that it's a cactus and a penguin. Similarly, you can say that a prickly cactus and a prickly penguin, you can imagine one that's been freshly shaven, also would have something similar in common, despite the fact that they might be very different as single arguments. But most of our computational models of cognition and language, and also our models of brain activity, when built on purely associationist architectures, don't have the rules or symbols or abstract representations that might underlie such an expressive power. And now I'll go sort of cut to the meat of the question. So as all of you know, tensors and tensor products have been a popular way to represent word meanings and to bind words together in some models. And while they are no doubt a powerful way of representing information, and they have appealing mathematical properties, they run into some limitations exactly about the similarity issue. So without a lookup table to denote which arguments are bound together, which role and filler go together, which tensors are combined into the product, or a specialized decomposition function for each product, tensor products and neural systems will yield results that don't seem exactly consistent with human knowledge or behavior. Now, what I'm going to say now, I'm going to talk about in this portion of the talk, has actually already been shown in a simple proof by Alex Dumas and John Hummel several years ago. But I'll present some behavioral studies that we did comparing the predictions of a tensor product neural system and a competing time-based model system with human behavior. Right. So first, tensor products of bound roles and fillers, so like blue and potato, or blue potato, say that the similarity of the bound representation is 0 based on the similarity of the fillers, even if the same role, for example, in this case, A, or in the blue potato example, being blue, is present. Basically, the result is even though both products have the same relational role or same predicate, the relative similarity of the bound objects drives the cosine similarity value. And this is problematic for representing knowledge the way that humans do. So we want to be able to say that A is present, but in this scheme of representing things, we end up with the value of 0. Okay, so this means then that there's no longer independence between a role and a filler. And that's because of the multiplicative operator, the fact that we're using products. So that means that role filler binding tensors, so a la Smolensky, Plate, and Halford in seminal important work, end up being subject to the superposition catastrophe. So that is a tensor product of 2 or more vectors. The ith, jth element of the tensor is the product of the ith and jth elements of the input vectors, right? And it's a multiplicative interaction. But we know already that statistically, if we want independent effects, if we want to capture that information in the system, we need our effects to be additive and not interactive, right? That means that tensors struggle with the trade-off of role filler binding independence, or the independence of the role and filler information, and similarity, and that's representing similar things with similar vectors, which we can all agree we want our semantic system to capture. So we were interested in contrasting 2 approaches, so the tensor product approach with a dynamic binding approach. So here's just sort of a schematic cartoon. Now I've already done a bunch of bad cartoons in this talk, so maybe this is just another bad cartoon to add to your collection. But to illustrate to you how we imagine the system. So in a dynamic binding system, then you just have one representation of fuzzy, one representation of prickly, one representation of penguin, and one representation of cactus, and then you dynamically bind them together as needed, right? In a neural system based on tensors and tensor products, you end up with having multiple entries of fuzzy and prickly and cactus and penguin, and then tensor products that represent the combination of each of those. Now, to get at whether the limits on representing similarity on a tensor product-based neural system actually sort of intersects with human knowledge and behavior, we did 2 behavioral studies. So here we varied the similarity of individual words according to their, just in word2vec, we computed their cosine similarity first for our set of materials. And then we obtained ratings in 2 different studies. One were the ratings of just people moving a sliding bar to say how similar individual words are. So for example, how similar is fuzzy to prickly, how similar is penguin to cactus. We get all of those ratings. And from a second group of people, we asked them to rate the combination. So fuzzy penguin, prickly penguin, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just gonna take a drink of water real quick. So here are the data from the second experiment on the phrase similarity ratings. And the human behavior followed the predictions of our dynamic binding approach rather than the tensor product approach. And that's to say that an additive model better fit the data than an interactive one. So what's important to see here is that the ratings for the phrase, right? So when people get identical phrases, both models make the same prediction. So a tensor product-based system and a dynamic binding-based system should say that when you have 2 identical phrases, you perceive them as identical, so the most similar that's possible, right? And that's what people did, right? So when they saw the same phrases, they said these are the same. When they saw phrases that had nothing in common, they said these are different. What's really going to be the action that's going to help us adjudicate between the 2 representational architectures is looking at the cases where you had the noun being the same or the predicate being the same, in this case, the adjective being the same. And here, both models predict maximal similarity, as I said, when both roles and fillers are identical. But when we fit the model with and without that identity condition, we see that the better fitting model is really the one that uses dynamic binding. And most crucially, it's the model that's additive. So in other words, people are rating their similarity in an additive way, not in an interactive way. And their judgments of similarity are based on independent representations where similarity is driven not by the value of a single input word alone or the combination of them, but really by additive factors from each word. And so you can see that by the fact that even when it's only the noun overlapping or only the adjective or predicate overlapping, people are judging them to be similar. And that goes in the face of what a tensor product system would actually does predict, in the sense that there should be a cosine similarity of 0 when you have a different filler in each case. Okay. So what we can conclude from this is that human behavior seems to be more consistent with an additive, independent notions of similarity contributing to this. And that this isn't to say that tensor products aren't really useful for us in some ways, but that we need to at least consider what the information they are missing out on. And it's clear now that without a control structure, lookup table, or a decomposition function, tensor products will violate independence. So this goes further when we think about what are the expressive powers we want the system to have. So if we can bind f of x and f of y to each other in a dynamic or independent way, this, again, like I said, will qualitatively change what we can express in the system. And that means that we can generalize to novel arguments for free, because we're not bound or to care about creating a representation that's dependent between the two, right? We want that to preserve that independence. And also to sort of, foreshadow in a very long-term way, this clears the way for the system to actually then learn. When you can represent things in this way, you can learn from differences in your representations via abduction, right? So by comparing those representations and learning from them. So in the limit, that means that you can universally generalize in such a system. And this is an idea that Alex and I have been thinking about, and that Alex has been working on for quite a long time. All right, so what I've been saying, dynamic binding, sort of talking about it from the side without going directly into what I mean. And that's also for the sake of time, given that there are lots of things I want to tell you about. But let's explore a little bit briefly, very cursorily, how that could work. So here's a cursory illustration of unit activation in a dynamic binding system. And we use as our example in all of our papers together, Alex's model DORA, that's discovery of relations by analogy. And here the important thing to see is just that there are distributed codes in the feature layer at the bottom that pass activations to a 3-layered architecture that then uses those layers to bind information between 2 or more distributed representations in the feature layer, right? And another way to visualize this is to look at unit activation in time, where you sort of plot the activation function of an individual unit. So we have units on the distributed layer that are representing features of an object, and their distributed code in time then passes information further up. So the feature units make up a distributed code, while the other units code for relations or bindings between the distributed units, or conjunctive coding units that respond to the distributed codes and units below them, right? So in this way, then we can even visualize how fuzzy penguin, fuzzy cactus, and prickly penguin and prickly cactus might differ in this system, right? So they aren't going to give us exactly the same pattern. If you look at all the units in time, that's how we can distinguish them. That's how we can pull them apart in the system. That's also how, because their activation patterns will have some similarity among dimensions, that's also how we can determine whether they're similar or different. All right, again, that was a very short overview of some of the work that we've been developing together. Now I'll close this section of the talk with a perhaps controversial statement here. So if we want to say that human thought and language are compositional, and we agree that this requires independence between rules and fillers or arguments, and we see how tensor products violate that independence, then it also means that feed-forward architectures do too. Namely, purely feed-forward architectures violate independence because there's no relation or principled link between the input and output spaces, other than the mapping between those spaces that the neural network itself embodies. So that means that the input and output spaces could effectively result in a functional similarity of 0 between things that are in fact similar, like again, the problem we discussed when we look at fuzzy penguin versus fuzzy cactus. All right, so what are the interim conclusions that we can get from this section of the talk? Many of the things I've said comes from the fact that neural networks learn mappings, but not functions themselves, although they embody a function. So we see that without a control structure, our independence is violated in a tensor product-based neural system. But that if we use time, or actually any other signal, but time is sort of an appealing one, we can bind information together in a way that allows the system to achieve that independence. In our dynamic time-based binding systems, we give rise actually to neural oscillations by virtue of computation in these models. And that's going to be an interesting fact that I'll focus on for the rest of the talk. So now I want to talk about how we've acquired some data about linguistic structure in the brain, specifically in how linguistic structure might be cashed out in brain rhythms or neural oscillations. And this is very much part of the current research going on in my lab. So I'll show you how we acquire data about structure and brain rhythms. And then I'll later on try to tell you about how we've started to validate some computational models against human behavior. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about how we're starting to add structure to models and a theory that I've been developing. All right. So now I'll begin the second half of the talk, focused on neuroimaging work that tries to link oscillations to computation. So first, just a quick primer on neural oscillations. So here we see, again, cartoon. I'm filled with bad cartoons in this talk. We see a cartoon of raw EEG. We can see that it can vary in its phase and power, and that how if you take classically measured signals like event-related brain potentials, which have a long and rich tradition in neurolinguistics and psycholinguistics, that we actually miss out on a large part of the picture if we end up averaging all these things together. So what you can see, that you can, whether these signals line up in time determines how, when you average them together, what you see as the output. So it's clear that brain rhythms, not only are they sort of a key currency of computation in the brain is always having cycles of neural networks in the brain are having cycles of activation, refraction, and inhibition at all times, creating this rhythmic overall whole brain dynamics. But the point is they can contain more and different information than our classically measured and often averaged signals like event-related brain potentials. So as I said, the brain is inherently rhythmic in its processing, and there's lots of really interesting work in neuroscience about all different species, including humans on this. We also know that speech itself as a signal is quasi-rhythmic, right? So there seems to be something that's bringing all this together. If the stimulus is rhythmic, the processor is rhythmic, are these things coming together to perhaps help us explain how we can create structure by using time and rhythm? And how will that then link back to language? So here's how we approach the problem. So our long-term goal is to add time and rhythm to computational models, similar to the way that Dora has done, but also to see if conceptually we can develop a model that uses time and rhythm to make the system compositional, such that it can account for how unexpected and novel structures like blue and white striped whale are understood. And then we can use these different model architectures that we've created to investigate whether the brain builds structure in the way that we've hypothesized in the model. The model is really an expression of our hypothesis. And our goal is not just to find a model, see that it predicts brain activity or behavior and conclude that that is what the brain is representing, but rather to find bounds on the kinds of representations and computations that a system needs to carry out in order to produce those things. So we're not, it's a nuance there, but I think it's an important one. So the output of this process is both the neural systems that can represent functioning linguistic structures in the neural network model, but also sets of behavioral and brain data that we can use to validate the models. All right, so now I'm going to tell you about a single concrete example of this approach. So this is based on a highly influential study by Nai Ding and colleagues from 2016, where they use synthesized speech and a continuous stimulation paradigm. So you hear synthesized syllables presented at a isochronous fixed rate of 250 milliseconds, or a quarter of a second. And that creates a 4 Hertz signal that's in the stimulus that you hear. And the remarkable result here that Nai and colleagues showed was that you also get in the brain responses at 1 Hertz and 2 Hertz, even though there's nothing in the physical signal at those frequencies. Right? You can see that by comparing the panel B to panel C, right? And they argue that this reflects the cortical tracking of words, phrases, and sentences. But the question is the brain just tracking the timing of these phrases and sentences, or is this actually reflecting the computation of them? And that's what's causing this readout at 1 or 2 Hertz. So we asked if we could use a computational model like Dora to bind information, and as we were doing that, we could create a functionally linguistic representation of the sentence, while also producing the readout, the neural activity that looked similar to human brain activity when people process the same sentences. So here are the results of a simulation using Dora that produces both linguistic structure and rhythms of computation that echo the ones from the brain. So here in the blue line, that represents the brain rhythms that the Ding et al. Paper found when people listen to word phrases and sentences. And the dotted red spikes are the activation of the structured model, DORA, that used time and rhythm to process the stimulus into a structure, right? So then we compare this to an RNN, which we've denoted its activation with the black line at the bottom. I'll show you different plots in a second. And both models were trained to criterion. So they could both predict with 100% accuracy the next word in the stimulus set from Ding and colleagues. But the point is to solve that task, which they both do equally well. The RNN didn't have to form any structure. That's actually not its intention, right? It's not built for that. Nor did it form any rhythmic pattern of activation, also not its architectural need, right? It wasn't meant to do that. But the point is here to see that it's a sort of by virtue of the fact of how DORA computes information by using time to bind together words into predicates and into larger structures, that gives off a very similar pattern in the frequency space as we observe in the human brain rhythm, right? And this suggests that brain rhythms and the building of structure could be closely linked. And just to be a little bit more specific, we see that the RNN, it was only about 10% of the nodes in the RNN that were active about 4 Hertz, right? So that's just showing some sensitivity to the rate of the input word and the presentation rate in the model. All right, so that was, again, a very quick overview of this work. But the point is that we can use time-based binding across a layered neural network to give a possible explanation for how perceiving these hierarchical structures from the sequence ends up producing human-like oscillations, both in the brain and in our model. All right, so now this is the PhD work of a student in my group, Greta Caulfield, who got really interested in this problem. So in the exciting results from Ding and colleagues, and also in the sort of broad conceptual claims of a structured model for language. But she wanted to ask the same question in her PhD work with more naturalistic speech, that is, with naturally produced sentences. So we didn't want to make the conclusions that we observed in the Ding and colleagues data and in the modeling effort that Alex and I did of it. We didn't want that to be restricted only to the case of isochronous speech, so when the timing of the input is very heavily controlled. So Greta took a different approach in her work, where she used naturally produced sentences that we then were going to vary along interesting dimensions. So we wanted to have a sentence condition where we have naturally produced sentence. Then we made a Jabberwocky version of that, or like what I like to call prosodic Jabberwocky, where we have the sentence rhythm or prosody intact, but we've used pseudo words. And so we can show in the modulation spectra, which I'll show you in a second, that the modulation spectra between a sentence rhythm and a prosodic Jabberwocky sentence rhythm are very close together. And then we had word lists, which have the lexical content of all of the sentence words, but in an order such that you can't really combine them easily into a sentence. And this is crucial because it's going to allow us to tease apart whether the brain is tracking the occurrence of words, phrases, and sentences on their time scale, or whether that tracking signal in the brain is really about the content that the brain cares about. So is it oriented towards linguistic content, and could it possibly reflect the combination of representations into larger ones, just larger structured representations? So in order to do this, we took some methods from speech processing and auditory neuroscience, that is computing the mutual information or similarity between a stimulus and a brain response across these different conditions. And so just to give you an idea of what the stimuli were like, so we had sentences that were like this in their Jabberwocky non-word version, and then also a word list, right? I'll just give you a second to look at this. And then you can see from the modulation spectra that we have for each condition a forward version and a backward version. So there it's important to see that there's not a lot of difference between what's actually in the physical signal for each of these. And crucially, we've got the closest difference between sentence and Jabberwocky, with word lists being slightly different, which is to be expected. But crucially, what Greta finds is that the brain rhythms track the most structured condition, the sentence condition, over and above when the physical properties are carefully controlled for, and over and above words alone, right? So this is more evidence that brain rhythms are really tracking linguistic structure even when you control for the effect on the brain from the prosodic or sound properties of the speech, which we did in two ways, by the backward control, but also by the prosodic Jabberwocky condition. Again, this is the PhD work of Greta Caulfield. And we really think that this is a convincing illustration of how when you cut up the brain response during the processing of speech into phrase length, word length, and syllable length parts, that's what you can see in the column of this graph. You can see that on the time scale of words and phrases, the brain is more attuned to linguistic structure rather than to the prosodically matched or sound-based controls or the unstructured word list. And you can see that by looking at the fact that the sentence condition, the green condition, and the green dot and distribution, it's always higher than the orange, the prosodic control, or the purple, the word control. So this illustrates nicely that it's not just the physical or non-language properties of the stimulus that are driving the brain's entrainment to the stimulus. All right, so the takeaway from that is that the most structured and compositional thing we presented, the sentence, was most attractive or entraining to the brain. And we can now say that that tracking goes beyond acoustic and prosodic controls, right? And again, it suggests that tracking is really based on linguistic content and not just the timescale it occurs on. All right, so now I'd like to say a little bit more about our medium-term goals. So we've talked about how we acquire data about structure and brain rhythms, and given one example. But now I want to talk a bit about how we've been trying to validate some of our computational models against human behavior. And then again, I'll return to the last part about how we might add structures to some to existing models. So here's a preliminary result that I'm excited about, and it's the PhD work of Kas Koopmans in collaboration with a master's student in the group, Kartikeya Kaushik. And together they did a study where they asked people to click on the second blue ball. So show people a display, and they gave them the instruction to click on, and then they would read a sentence with a phrase like second blue ball. So to us, second blue ball automatically means the second of the set of blue balls, or of blue balls, the second one. So however, another interpretation is technically possible. That's the second ball that also happens to be blue, or for example, you could think of it as second and blue ball. So the question is, which meaning do people perceive? So people overwhelmingly click on the second blue ball on the display that is of the blue balls, the second one. And you could also sort of know that as an armchair experimenter yourself if you just introspected about that. But here now we have actually experimental proof that that's the case. And there's actually only 3 instances in the entire experiment where people said otherwise, and in all 1,600 trials with 29 participants. So it seems that people really just don't ever interpret second blue ball to mean second and blue. But if you ask a sequence model to do this simple task, things turn out a bit differently, right? So here's an illustration of how an LSTM would process this task, which we trained it to do, which is very similar to the sequential way that people read the prompt and then process the image before they respond, right? So you have a layer for each word, and then a layer that's going to represent the visual display. So in the first experiment with the sequence model, we didn't give it any structured responses. So we just told it, you know, here's the training data, and here we want you to respond. We only gave it cases where the linear interpretation was available, right? So we didn't get any hierarchical responses, only linear ones, but that was sort of by design as a test, because that we knew we could train that to be deduced by the model perfectly, which it was, right? So the model always picks out the second ball that was also blue. But when you add responses to the training data that are based on hierarchical structure knowledge to the routine of the model, the sequence model could then learn to give responses that over time became more similar to human behavior, right? And we can see this by the growing orange bar and the growing orange line in the plots. So in order to do this, we really wanted to start from the very base assumption, right? So either you give it the training data that's consistent with an hierarchical interpretation, or one that's not. So if you don't give it, obviously it's not going to learn it. So that's our baseline. But even if you do give it, it doesn't fully mimic human behavior, but it starts to approach it, right? So it can begin to learn to give hierarchical responses as a result of training. Now, but we want to know what underlies its behavior. What did the model actually learn? So we did 2 other experiments, and the first focused on training on ambiguous data. So here, the model was trained to map an ambiguous display with a second position. And then we tested it on again on the ambiguous different set of ambiguous stimuli, right? So whether you could say in this case, one interpretation is that the target is in position 2, that would be the linear response, which people don't give, versus the target is in position 4, which is the hierarchical response that people do give, right? I want to say, okay, given the training on ambiguous data, what does it do in this case when tested? And here we can see that while the model can perfectly identify when the target is absent, so when nothing matches the description at all is present, it struggles to identify when the hierarchical interpretation is needed. But it can do this fine with linear trials. So this indicates that what the model is learning in order to solve the problem, even when it gives hierarchical responses in the first case, is not truly a hierarchical structure, right? I wanted to just investigate even more, though, what's underlying this ability to produce this correct behavior after training. So we wanted to ask whether what the model has learned could support either kind of generalization. So interpolation, that is returning third red ball when you've been trained on third and red separately but not together, or extrapolation, then that's returning third red ball when you have never seen third but had seen second or fourth, right? That's the last experiment we're going to do. And then in addition to that experiment, we also repeated the experiment with different kinds of training data, so with word embeddings versus one-hot vectors, to see if that would change the performance, right? So the short answer is not really. It doesn't really affect the performance. So here you see that the percentage of correct hierarchical responses on both generalization tests after the different types of training. So each drop in the plot reflects the average hierarchical accuracy in one simulation run, and the box plot refers to the overall distribution of this accuracy, right? So the horizontal line reflects the chance after, and we also have, you can see there, a random condition where we have the model after random training as well. So here we see there isn't much difference as a function of the kind of training data. And for extrapolation, everything is clearly a chance. And that extrapolation result is consistent with recent work by Brendan Lake and Marco Baroni on a similar question. But for the interpolation question, things are getting slightly better for the word-to-vec embeddings, both the dimensionality reduced version and the unreduced version. And we think this boost in performance comes from the fact that there is still some similarity information available from the embeddings. And so when we look at the heat map of the cosine similarity between the 300-dimensional word embeddings or between the 11-dimensional word embeddings, the dimensionality reduced version, we can see that the similarity or the relatedness between blue, green, and red is indicated by a large positive cosine similarity. And this is probably what's enabling the model to interpolate slightly better than chance, but still very close to chance in these cases. All right. So just to sum up a bit on that last section, what we've seen here is that we're by adding the sort of hierarchical response that comes so naturally to humans, we can improve model performance slightly. But what the models have turned out to actually learn underlyingly neither supports generalization nor applies to ambiguous training data. So that seems to suggest that what the models have actually learned isn't analogous to what humans seem to know about language. But it does indicate also a promising way to start validating our models by comparing them to human behavioral tasks. Okay. So now for the last section of the talk, I'd like to briefly tell you about some work in progress and other approaches that people in my group are taking to adding structure to models. And then I'll very briefly describe the sort of theoretical model context in which all of this work that I've talked about through the talk slots into. So this is Dr. Sanne Over, a postdoc in my group, who started working on modeling a corpus of spoken Dutch conversations. So these are recorded customer service calls, so full of natural speech with lots of interruptions and speech errors and pauses. And Sanne is interested in explaining how timing in speech and computation might relate, right? So what's the ultimate goal here is relating the model she's developing to neural data from natural speech. And so far she's begun simply by trying to incorporate linguistic structural constraints like predictability into a sequence model and see if that alone begins to make the behavior of the model more rhythmic. So we take these constraints extracted from a spoken corpus, and at the same time, she incorporates neuroscientific principles like inhibition and an internal endogenous rhythm to computation that then is intended to try to mimic in a very coarse way how the brain computes in time. And Sanne wanted to see if we add these basic principles to a sequence model, can we get the model to better approximate both human behavior to predictable and unpredictable language, and also the human brain rhythms to predictable and unpredictable instances of a sentence. That is work in progress, but a promising approach, I think. And so lastly, I'll just give an example of the sort of recent iteration of a theoretical model I've been developing for several years. That's based on the idea of seeing language as a form of perceptual cue integration. And the idea here is that knowledge of language is combined with the speech or sign signal via gain and inhibition. And that's what allows us to package information in time, as we saw earlier in the talk. And that in turn leads to the rhythmic signals that we observe in the brain. I'm continuing to develop this model. My goal is to try to explain how hierarchical structure and compositionality might arise in neural networks, yet be bounded by known computational mechanisms in neuroscience, without losing sight of the kinds of representations that we're trying to explain. So I'll just give you a very brief mad dash through the model. So here the idea is that linguistic structure arises in a manifold space in the temporal dynamics of neural networks activating. And that in itself is a form of perceptual inference. So sensory percepts cue, activation of different aspects of the internal model of language. All these are distributed codes. And the temporal distribution of these activation patterns results in the functionally linguistic structure I've been talking about. And its gain modulation and crucially inhibition are the assembly level computations that produce representations of linguistic structure that are ultimately derived from sensory inputs. So in the paper, I have a longer description with pseudocode, a glossary of all the terms I use, and a range of predictions the model makes. And in the end, I end up describing linguistic representations as trajectories in a manifold. And this renders linguistic structure building as an expression of coordinate transform, which is an operation that repeats across the brain, multiplexed in time. So if you're interested in that, please check out this paper. I would love to hear anyone's feedback or response to it. All right, to sum up, I've taken you on a mad dash through work going on in the group, Language and Computation and Neural Systems, where we're really interested in uniting principles from linguistics, from psychology, from computation, and neuroscience. And our goal is really trying to find different ways to compute structure using time and rhythm and a variety of neural network models and validating against brain data and behavioral data. With the overall goal developing a theory of how neural systems might come to represent language and structure beyond statistical association, of which human language itself is really a canonical and beautiful example. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and also I'd like to thank all the members of my group. And I look very much forward to hearing your questions and being able to answer them offline very much. So thank you for your attention.